let me introduce Tom Reid. Tom's a fine person I met, I think, around 2009 in Zanesville, Ohio for the first time. And we were able to work together in support of the Connecting Appalachia project that Horizon Telephone out of Chillicothe implemented in the region. Basically, Tom's efforts, and we helped with some of the weightlifting, but he did a lot, resulted in a $66 million NTIA grant, if I'm remembering right, Tom. You can correct me when you speak if I'm wrong. And that grant went to Horizon, and they built a middle mile fiber backbone throughout 34 counties, and not just Appalachia, Ohio, but even expanded to a couple, no, back then it would have been 5 counties outside of Appalachia. So Tom recently submitted a proposal, and we selected him. You all selected him back in November, I believe it was, to contract him to do our broadband, be our broadband planning coordinator. So without further ado, Tom is well-versed in this stuff. He will talk 10 times more intelligently than I speak about it. So I would ask you to give him your attention, because you will learn today. So Tom, take it away.
Well, thanks, John. Great introduction. Great, excellent. Yeah, so happy to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with OVRDC and work with John again. As he mentioned, we've known each other for quite a while. Before that BTOP project, we also led the formation of the Southern Ohio Healthcare Network that centered largely in the OVRDC counties to build out fiber to the healthcare providers. So there's been a lot of successes with broadband in the area, but unfortunately, the reality is still difficult. We've still got a pretty significant digital desert that we'll talk about. And then some technology options. We don't want to just complain about the problem, we want to solve the problem. I'm going to talk about one of the biggest things in the area of broadband expansion, which is the FCC Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And then the next steps with OVRDC. So this is the unfortunate reality. This is way back in 2013 when the FCC, when the Wall Street Journal ran a story about the lack of broadband in our area. And as we all know, we end up with a lot of job seekers and students going to places like McDonald's and the libraries to gain access to the internet. And then the pandemic hit, and now their only opportunity is to sit in their car in a parking lot in a lot of cases. So it went from bad to even worse. And we just haven't made a lot of progress in this last mile problem. The reason there's a digital divide in the first place really boils down to population density as the primary factor. So if you look at these cities, Columbus has 1,500 households per square mile. And you get down to McConnellsville, you've got about 500 households per square mile. But we get into the more rural areas like ours, the entirety of Vinton County is 32 households per square mile. And then you get into even smaller areas like Walnut Township in Gallia, where you're dealing with 1 to 2% of the population density of Columbus. And so the reality is that population density drives how much you have to spend per household to provide broadband. If there's a lot of people in one space and you build fiber, you cover a lot of people. When it's all spread out, it costs a lot more, and they're just per household. And there just is no way to build a viable business case in these really remote areas. But that's, we've spent $85 billion though since the year 2000 to solve this problem. And I like to use highways as an analogy because we understand how to build highways and we've been very successful at it. That it costs $10 to $20 million per mile to construct a 4-lane limited access highway. And yeah, every public project has some level of waste, fraud, and abuse associated with it. But at the end of the day, you can drive the highway. The carriers have received $85 billion since the year 2000, specifically to improve telecommunications in rural America. And that digital highway is missing. And this money came from a program established by Congress directing the FCC to add surcharges to our telephone bills so that we could have a level playing field between urban areas and rural areas in terms of telephone services. And then in later years, it became focused on expanding broadband into these areas as well. So this isn't some new entitlement. The FCC has been getting this money for a long time. They've been distributing it for a long time. And for having spent $85 billion, that's enough money to build fiber to every single household in rural America. And we know that's not our current situation. So we've really got to do a better job investing this money. So going back to the road analogy, so imagine we just stopped all road maintenance for a few decades. Well, you'd start out with huge potholes, and then over a number of years, the earth would take back that pavement and you'd end up with a four-wheeler track. That's what's happened in our copper infrastructure. Copper's fine for telecommunications, but when it's 50, 60-year-old copper, it's not going to work anymore. And that's the situation we're in. It's well past end of life, and it can't deliver reliable telephone services, let alone broadband. So really what we have is our areas have been basically abandoned by the big telephone companies. We did a project for Buckeye Hills, similar to what we're doing now for OVRDC. And that analysis was really pretty stark, that we found that about 75% of the physical geography lacked broadband as the FCC currently defines broadband, which is only 25 megabits download speed and 3 megabits upload speed. Now, a lot of people argue that's not a big enough number. I agree, it's not a big enough number. But even at that small benchmark of 25.3, in the 8-county area of Buckeye Hills, 75% of the geography did not meet that according to our analysis, which is a bigger number than the FCC would claim. So we'll be addressing the OVRDC counties next. The reality in these super rural areas is even worse. So the FCC accepts data from the carriers on what's called Form 477. They don't question it. They don't verify it. They just say, well, okay, that area must have service. So according to them, in any given 100,000 people and 100,000 households, only about 38,000 of them would be unserved. According to our analysis, that's more like 80 to 90% is unserved. So it'd be more like 80 to 90,000 out of that 100,000 are currently unserved.
So, Reid, could I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Isn't it true that sometimes the way they measure served and unserved areas, let's say in Jackson County, they had run, broadband, and they just went into like 3 houses in Vinton County, and then they say, okay, well, that whole area of Vinton County is covered, although they only touched maybe 3 houses right on the county line.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons for the major overstatement. But people keep quoting these crazy FCC numbers when we know that it's 3 to 10 times more households that are unserved than the FCC thinks. And this is exactly what you're talking about. Happens to be a Meigs County example. It's about 740 acres. There's a total of 14 households. And so this is a pretty low population density example. And this is a frontier area. What Frontier did is see way down here in that southern point of that census block, they served 1 household. And that whole census block gets marked as served on the map. And maybe that's fine in an urban area to say that if I touch one part of a census block, that's enough to say I can serve all of it, but not when it's a square mile. So then they moved a little bit further down the same road, served 1 house in this census block. Whole census block gets marked as served. And all these areas get then blocked out of other federal funding programs and some state funding programs. So in this particular case, it's a 13-to-1 overestimation of coverage. And we're not the only people talking about this. According to the FCC, about 25 million Americans don't have broadband at that 25.3 benchmark. According to Microsoft, it's 163 million. So they study people connecting to their services to see what kind of speeds they have. And they feel it's a much bigger number. In their case, they're saying it's 7-to-1. Mobile is also overstated. This is again back to the Buckeye Hills region. The yellow areas are the areas that until late in 2019 the FCC said that these yellow areas are the only areas lacking mobile coverage. But ODOT paid for a contractor to drive around with phones from all three major providers, and they plotted a red dot every place that they couldn't pick up a signal from any of those major providers. So you can see in a lot of cases, it's basically all the roads. You know, Morgan County, there's not much service, even though the FCC said it was much more minor. FCC finally abandoned their maps, and they're trying to figure out how to map mobile services now because they saw too many examples like this, and they finally gave up.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
This is Dave Painter from Claremont County. Just a question. Kind of differentiate between mobile service and broadband. I mean, it's possible to have broadband by fiber optics at your home, but not be able to have mobile service at your home, and vice versa. One of the things that one of the providers, I have a son that lives in a place called Mount Orb here in Ohio, and they do not have service where they're at, but yet they can put what they call a cantana on their home, and they can get service then. Very expensive. You know, it's through your mobile home provider. In his particular case, it's Verizon. So that shows that, you know, you have a signal that's capable of bringing it into the house, but you don't have the hardware technology on the outside of the house to do it. Can you kind of just differentiate between the two?
Sure. Yeah. If you're lucky enough to get high quality broadband to your home, like through fiber, you can actually turn your phone, set your phone so it'll go across your Wi-Fi connection. So you right there at your home, you could get it, but you know, you get out, 400 feet away from your home, and you're not going to have cell phone service again. So the cell phone service to me is about having a modern communications infrastructure serving our area. I mean, we get questions like, okay, seriously, what am I supposed to do when I come upon a traffic accident? Am I supposed to keep driving till I can get cell phone service so I can call 911? Or do I stop and try to help them? It's like, that's a horrible thing for us to have to ask ourselves, right? So the mobile service is kind of a subset of the problem of broadband. So if we can get high quality broadband in the areas, at least you can have mobile service in your own little neighborhood. But what's happened in a lot of these cases, as you were talking about with a person using a cantana, we can, if you don't have any other access, a 4G signal from AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile provides pretty good broadband services. That's what Sean O'Malley is using from his home, a member of our team. And so you can connect to that and put it in a router and serve multiple computers in your house. And we've done a lot of that in this pandemic. There are a lot of school children now that are being served with a 4G hotspot that allows them then to have Wi-Fi in their house. So it's kind of a makeshift broadband solution while we're waiting for real broadband to happen. Did that answer your question?
You did. Thank you.
Welcome.
And this is Sean, according to the FCC, my road out here on the ridge I live on is covered with broadband. In practice, I have to use a self connection.
Yeah, way too many cases of that. So as I mentioned, we don't want to just identify the problem. We want to try to figure out how to solve it. So the approach is to develop an overarching architecture. And we do that by selecting representative areas and then figuring out what will work in that representative area and then extrapolate it across the rest of the service area. So we look at three options: satellite, hybrid wireless, and fiber to the premise. And we've already done this in the Buckeye Hills region. I think the OVRDC region is going to be a little different. The terrain is different, so we're going to need to pick different sample areas to look at, but a similar process, and we'll look at the same three technologies. So the idea is pick an engineering zone. Our first engineering zone in the Buckeye Hills project was over in Meigs County. It had a population density and a terrain profile that was very typical. And you identify one area like this, it's not going to change a whole lot. And as a matter of fact, when we picked our second area, the numbers turned out almost exactly the same. This process works. Instead of trying to engineer all those counties, 5,000 square miles, 6,000 square miles, that's very difficult and expensive to do, versus we can pick 50 square mile portions that are representative, engineer those, and have a pretty high level of confidence that the numbers will extrapolate. So satellite, it's a real interesting space right now. The things like HughesNet and Viasat, what are called geosynchronous. They sit up over the equator and they're 23,000 miles up, and just to send a signal up there and get a signal back takes about a half a second. So you can't do anything like Zoom. You can't really have a decent telephone call, and they tend to get throttled. So the latency is that delay in the round trip. And then the throttling is when you exceed the bandwidth caps, then you end up with very low speeds. The next thing on the horizon are these low Earth orbit satellites. These are not sitting over the equator. They're in these polar orbits, kind of spinning around the planet. SpaceX with their Starlink is the first operational LEO in the world. And I think we've got some demo sites coming up in our area pretty soon for beta. The Starlink's really interesting, and I think it could solve some of our problems. Another thing it'll do is provide competition, where right now you might have just Frontier available. If suddenly Starlink is available, it will cause competitive pressures on Frontier to perform better. We've seen a lot of reaction when we were building the Southern Ohio Healthcare Network. Suddenly Charter rushed into the area and built a mess of fiber. Well, the reason we did the Southern Ohio Healthcare Network is we couldn't get any fiber to our healthcare providers in the area. But once we announced we were doing it, then suddenly Charter came in and did it too. And now we can get fiber from either Horizon or Charter to almost everywhere in our healthcare communities. So the same thing could happen in the last mile piece, where having something like Starlink there is helpful in getting competitive juices flowing. I don't think we should try to subsidize it with public dollars, unless it's just subsidizing the cost for the end user, because it is pretty expensive. But it's not really, it doesn't beat terrestrial infrastructure. So things that are on the ground, much harder to disrupt the services. So satellite's interesting, especially this low Earth orbit, but we don't think it's the long-term answer for the region. So the other big one is fixed wireless, and that's what we're talking about with these Marks towers. It could have a significant impact. And if you look at it like in Northwestern Ohio, where it's flat, you go up to the top of a 300-foot tower and boy, you can see a long ways. You can really imagine that signal being able to reach pretty distant homes. In Appalachia, our gorgeous hills and our heavy woodlands really cause a limitation of the reach of these wireless signals. Can't get down into many of the hollers. So it's a great solution basically for houses that are on ridge tops. You come down off the ridge top and you start losing coverage. As an example, this is again in our study area in Meigs County. We just put where these stars are. We just located at the highest points we could find 3 towers, each of them 300 feet tall, and then looked at what we could hit and what we couldn't hit. And the dark colors means it could be hit by multiple towers. And so you'll see along these ridge tops, good coverage. You get down into the hollers, even with 3 towers that close together, we can't get into those hollers. So if your goal is how can we really quickly alleviate some of our broadband problems, then fixed wireless is going to be a great answer, and putting things up on those Marks towers can be a great answer. If your goal is to reach 100% of the households, it's not going to get there with just fixed wireless. So the other option is fiber to the premise. It sounds exotic and expensive, but it turns out actually costs out pretty well. So you run the fiber optic cable and then the drops to the houses. Generally in our area, you run those on existing utility poles. Depends on the geology of the area. If the rock is close to the surface, it's definitely the cheapest way to go, is to put it on the existing utility poles. Tremendous capacity with fiber. Do gigabit easily. We could do 10 gigabits, 100 gigabits. There's amazing capacity with the fiber. So as demands grow from decade to decade, because I try to think about this in 30 or 40 year increments. As demand grows, the fiber would keep up with it. It is pretty expensive, but you do get a long lifetime. It's also going to be necessary if we're ever going to have mobile services throughout the area. Because same problem, the mobile companies, they put up a big tower and then they go, oh, that should cover a 5-mile radius. Well, it would in the flatlands, it does not in the hills. So the only way we're going to get mobile services in these areas are from little microcells running along the roads, which require these fiber optic cables. There are issues there as well. So if you're not familiar with the whole power utility industry, I never used to look at power poles at all until I got into this business. There's the primary lines, secondary lines, and then service wires is kind of the power space of a pole. And then you hit the communication space of the pole. It has to be 40 inches below the power space. And so what happens is you need to have a minimum clearance. And so if you're the next person wanting to attach to those poles, big question is, can you maintain minimum clearance at the kind of deepest part of that sag? And in our area, that becomes difficult again because of the terrain. So there ends up being a need to basically, if this clearance wasn't sufficient, they have to replace this pole and replace this pole just so that this attachment point could be higher. The poles might be fine, but they're just not tall enough to handle another attachment without violating clearance rules. So that ends up being pretty expensive. It's logistically a lot easier to do near a roadway, but we end up with a lot of remote locations where poles have to be replaced. And the cost of this is pretty unpredictable, basically ranging in a very dramatic range of $15,000 to $75,000 per mile. The fiber costs about $25,000 per mile. So you can see it, the make ready has a big impact. And we've talked to Buckeye Rural, we've talked to Washington Electric, we've talked to AEP about this, and I'm convinced that their pole infrastructure issues are real. And the Lawrence County experience really shows that we do want grid resiliency. So we have to figure out somehow to cover these costs if we go the fiber optic direction. So that brings us to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It draws from that Universal Service Fund, the same place that the $85 billion came from. And it's a $20 billion budget awarded in 2 phases. Phase 1, they do an auction. That auction ended in December of last year. And this is by far the biggest broadband funding program. So as an example, NTIA has $300 million. This is $20 billion. State of Ohio is talking about a couple $100 million. And again, this is $20 billion. So 100 times bigger than most of the competing programs. So that's why we focus so much on these FCC programs. So what the FCC does is they say, what's the cost to build to a household? And they only assume fiber. Their assumption is that in their process is that they're going to build fiber. And so it's pretty linear. If you've got 16 households per square mile, you'll spend about $2,500 per household to build fiber. If you've only got 4 households per square mile, you're going to be up around 10,000. So it's, if you have to build a mile of fiber, costs about the same as building a mile of fiber anyplace else. It's all about how many houses can you pass with that mile. Then the FCC says, well, how much revenue do we think you can earn from that? And that becomes what they call the reserve. That's the subsidy that they say a profit-based company would need to be able to affordably build into these areas. So they came out phase 1 saying that there are 190,000 households unserved in Ohio. We know there's at least 340,000 households unserved in Ohio. The number's probably higher. Our next mapping iteration will help us quantify that better. And you'll see $7,000 more focus in on the OVRDC area. So this portion of Gallia County was over $7,000 a household at 100% of the reserve. Get down into some of these areas in Pike County that the FCC feels is easier to reach. It's under $2,000 a household. So if we got 100% of the reserve, it'd be $840 million available in Ohio. They do what's this reverse auction. They just keep lowering the percentage of the subsidy that's available until there's no more bidders. That happened at National Clearing Round of 60% was when they reached their budget. So they knew they needed to spend 27 billion, but they only gave themselves a budget of 16 billion. The National Clearing Rounds, what they call that, Ohio would have gotten $500 million. But Ohio, among with some other states, were bid really aggressively. And we still don't quite understand how it got so aggressive, but they bid it all the way down to 20%. So that's $330 million that we should have gotten in Ohio that we didn't. And according to the FCC's own numbers, then the people who won the money need to show that they have $670 million to invest to complete this. So looking at who won, I'll go ahead and zoom into OVRDC area. Charter was a big winner in Ohio. They won about half of the households available in Ohio. And see, they picked up large areas of Gallia County, Jackson, Vinton, even over in Brown and Adams and Highland. So Charter bid in areas around areas they're already serving. So that's pretty logical service area. Then you end up with companies like Mercury Wireless. See these blue splotches? They have blue splotches. If you look at the state, you have little blue splotches across about half the state, maybe a little bit more. And we're really concerned about that because if you look at Gallia County or Vinton County, if they're already here, well, it makes sense for Spectrum to build out here, right? It's gonna work. It just expands their existing service area. Mercury Wireless, as an example, has no service area in Ohio. They don't have any operations here at all, and they're somehow going to make sense of connecting all these little pockets. We don't think it's going to work. We really don't think it's viable. Adams, Highland, Pike, they got picked up by a company called Nextier. They have no operations in Ohio, and they only picked up about $1 million to serve what we all know are very remote and very rugged areas. So again, very concerned about Nextier as well. And then you'll see some other they've got a little bit of LTD broadband in these little teeny spots, got a little bit of connect to everyone in little teeny spots. It's not the way telecommunications works. Telecommunications works by establishing service areas that are fairly large so you can staff them and maintain them and things like that. We're really concerned about how this is going to work out. A concern with all of them, we know Charter has deep pockets, but we're afraid all of the recipients are going to be influenced by cherry picking. So again, we look at the population density, the cost per household, that cost to deploy, and the reserve. So if we'd gotten 100% in Ohio, it'd be about $4,600 per household. At 60%, we'd be about $2,600 per household. But this got bid all the way down to $889 per household in Ohio. And when they award this money, they award it on the average. So some places were awarded, were tagged with much higher subsidies, some places lower, but they average it across the state. So you could take 85% of the money and serve only 70% of the area, which means that there's a financial incentive to abandon the most remote areas. And that financial incentive works. I'll get into the penalties in a second. It works because of the very low penalties from the FCC. So again, just looking at the delta here, they need about $3,500 a household. Okay, so the places I'm concerned about are either really remote census blocks or, in this case, really remote households. So this is an example, again, in Meigs County, where you can see this very remote household here. And if you delete that one location from your obligation as Charter or Connect Everyone or any of these companies, you would reduce your build, you'd eliminate 4,100 feet of build and $20,000 to $40,000 of costs to build. But the penalty you'd pay to the FCC would be no more than $1,300. So what CFO is going to say, no, we need to build to that household because we said we would, when the penalty you pay the FCC is just a fraction of what it would cost you to build it. So we're afraid there's going to be these isolated households that get dropped. We're also concerned then if you see just a really remote census block, they might drop the whole thing and just serve the more profitable areas. And this is, you can't blame a profit-based company for making these kind of decisions. This is really a problem with how the FCC formed the rules. And with intervening terrain and foliage, we can't hit that with a wireless link. So we're talking about the penalties that in the most remote 5% of our region, an isolated household might cost $30,000, the average household might cost $10,000, and they'll only pay $889. They escalate that as you get further out to $1,300 for the most remote 15%, but that's still, a huge motivation to drop them. And we're not going to know about it until year 9. That's because of their process. They're in due diligence right now with the winners of the auction. Then they'll be giving them monthly payments for 10 years. And the first deployment milestone's not until the end of year 3 at 40%. And then you'll see we don't reach 100% until year 8. If you miss your interim milestones, you just have to go to quarterly reporting. There's no other penalty. If you miss your 6-year milestone, so you didn't reach 95%, they just give you an extra year. If you decided not to deploy some areas, you don't face that penalty until year 8 or year 9. So it's going to be, we have people stranded for a long time under the current FCC rules. So we think it's really important instead to have open infrastructure that'll give you 30 to 40 year capacity, shorten those deployment milestones so we can reach 100% of households in 4 years, and require full transparency from the recipients. That's another problem with these FCC programs is they don't have to tell us anything. The recipients don't, and the FCC won't tell us anything about progress reports, project deployment timelines, or anything. They don't have to give us any of that information. And we've tried to get it. We appealed to the FCC to give us information under another program. They refused, said it was proprietary. We asked a congressman friendly to us to seek the same information. He was excited to do it, got the exact same results back. It looks like something you'd get from the NSA. It was all redacted. You'd see, it was Frontier and it was for this reporting period, and basically everything else was blacked out. We filed on this, and if you're interested, we'll distribute these slides later. We made a filing about these issues with RDOF to the FCC. We're also circulating that to our congressional parties to try to get attention to this before they start awarding this money. Other good news is there are a lot of funding sources out there. There's the FCC Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, but NTI has money. Innovate Ohio is probably going to have money. There's the past COVID legislation, the upcoming COVID legislation, ARC, EDA. There's just a lot of potential funding, and the big one on the horizon is federal infrastructure funding. So this is also work we're trying to influence in Congress to avoid these problems of the FCC programs. So our next steps, we'll want to identify government-owned parcels and vertical assets because those may become useful for ISPs who want to deploy. And we're not saying that every government asset or parcel would be available. We just want to know where they are so that as we're looking at areas, gee, look, here's some land that the township owns that we're trying to serve. Let's approach the township and see if the ISP can use some of that land. So that's the idea of identifying all those assets. Then we want to catalog and map existing projects. There's generally a lot of activity going on. I know Southern Ohio Communications has some work going on. We just want to, as much as possible, share information with each other about what's going on so we can reach out to them, include them in our maps if they're willing to be included, learn from them if what they're doing could be scaled up effectively, then that's the kind of thing we want to do. We want to find those private partners that can help. And we also want to look at areas of urgent need. And then find those ISP partners, because the more we can work with these small companies that are already in our area, the better for our area. They're going to be more responsive to our population and easier to track what they're doing. So we've been active in the data collection process. You'll see the kind of the status of the various efforts there, and any help you can give us in encouraging participation by counties that so far we don't have data from, that'd be helpful. Sean's been managing this process. So the coordination and matchmaking, as I mentioned, there's a lot of initiatives, no clearinghouse. So we're trying to provide that kind of clearinghouse function. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point when you hear about something going on. And we will do the outreach from there. A warm introduction is really helpful. You know, cold calling people is very difficult. So, you know, like if you knew Gary Cooper's doing something with socks and you want to go, hey, Gary, hey, Tom, I want to make sure you two can have a chance to talk about that. That's great. And then we have a warm introduction to that organization. And then provide some matchmaking. So across county lines, sometimes it's really important, like with the ARC projects and with public-private partnerships. And again, work with those local ISPs. And this is where really there's a very crucial role for OVRDC to play in brokering a lot of these relationships and in doing this analysis, data gathering, thinking at a bigger picture. Telecommunications generally doesn't pay attention to county boundaries. Telecommunications is more expansive. Like if we go up on a Marks Tower, that Marks Tower might be close to the boundary between two counties and it's going to serve multiple counties. We need to reflect all of those interests that we can as we're going after funding for those sort of efforts. So we'll be looking at short-term answers as well as long-term answers to try to relieve these problems as we improve the mapping and figure out options. So that's what I had for today. Sean's going to stay on the call. I'm going to have to jump in a couple of minutes, but happy to answer any other questions.
Well, I think that Mr. Hemmings was absolutely correct when he said, please listen, because you will learn today. And obviously, this was a tremendously detailed report that I think give all of us a lot of insight we did not have before. And obviously, it's something that you worked extremely hard on, and you made it very presentable and very understandable. And I just want you to know how appreciative we are.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate that.
Now, I do have a question.
Okay.
I would say that it's been an impetus to work in this area because of the pandemic and because of more people working at home, more schools having to be virtual and go online and things, and especially in our area, you know, where there probably isn't a school district that's, you know, totally available. You know, it's going to have outages here and there.
Yeah.
Some of the momentum that has created, are you afraid it might dissipate as hopefully we get back to a more normal lifestyle and, you know, people are able to go to school more freely and, you know, work in a, you know, with other people? Are you afraid that it might lose some of the momentum it has gained because of this?
It might. I hope it doesn't, but yeah, that's definitely a possibility, Randy.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be a good reason to try to get this infrastructure legislation through before
Yes,
interests fade.
absolutely. Try to do it while the capital. Are there any other questions?
Tom,
This
Dave Painter, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
You know, information there was just, you know, it is vast, and anyone that would hear you give that presentation would draw many conclusions and understand what the real problem and the real challenge is. One of the things I wanted to ask, and I know we've talked about that before, is that, you know, since they're using the ISPs as actual installers in service area, how many customers are available becomes part of the cost of installing the fiber, if you'd say that. But But that's kind of a flawed scenario in that actually the installation of the fiber costs the same per mile, taking away the terrain, I'll say that. But I mean, as far as stringing fiber on poles, a mile of fiber is a mile of fiber.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that they really flawed the whole program with, is that they're dependent on ISPs to install it. The cost per mile is based on, what you can gain in revenue and what the maintenance requirements are for that per customer area. When in fact, if they would bid to the actual installers to just identify it by street, identify it by highway, put the fiber up, and then have a contract where service providers could bid on picking up those customers, they could really get a bang for their buck here.
I agree. Well, the population density in these rural areas would also go up. We're losing population density because people can't live in these areas if they can't get broadband.
Correct. And I think that's the flawed bidding process that they have put themselves in right from the start.
I agree.
And that really, when I see that, what really needs to happen is somebody needs to be gotten to that really understands the business of installing infrastructure, stop this process, and then get back to, something that really is efficient and cost effective,
Agreed.
But I know we've had that conversation, and I know you agree just like me. So, but thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So this is Tom White from Ross County, and ditto to what everybody has said so far. Tom and John, I appreciate this presentation. My question is, are we working on some of these options that you've just shared simultaneous, just in case these companies defaulted and or they lost momentum, that we're simultaneously looking at other options that would keep this progressing, because this is huge, and it's like you guys are talking about, it's chicken and egg. We're not going to continue to get the development, in these rural areas if we don't have high-speed internet in this day and age and moving forward. I'll make one other comment, because I'm on school boards on a countywide basis up here in Ross County and Pike County. And we had a meeting the other day where Amazon, and this is tied to these solar projects, because Amazon's coming in and supporting those, and they're literally hiring people from the schools. Now this is, I'm not going to say it's confidential, but they're piloting it. My only point is these mega companies like Amazon, because they want, and they're trying to get manpower, so to speak, with students to code some of the things that they're interested in doing. So doing coding for them, and they're trading it. So their payment to these students, and they're starting in their freshman year in a 4-year program, that they can accumulate credits towards a degree. And so this is incredibly creative, but it's also, they want to see this high-speed internet as much, and they'll help fund it and so on and so forth. So I know that's more comments, but the question is really to keep this thing going, because this is huge, and I'm so encouraged by this conversation, Tom.
We'll definitely keep the long-term and short-term options on the table, and not going to count on RDOF as the answer. I had not heard about that Amazon coding effort. It's really interesting. I'm gonna have to look into that some more.
Because again, I don't believe it's confidential, and hopefully it's not, since I've just put this across the public. But it is a pilot program, and it's because I've been immersed in these solar projects and getting those moving, because as John has pointed out in the OVRDC, Southern Ohio is a prime area for these solar projects and this alternative energies. And within that, Amazon is jumping in to fund these, or be an investor, so to speak, in these solar projects. And then these are two separate things, but they're connected in my mind. Is they're working on, which makes sense. Amazon's not the only one that's looking for manpower or people
Sure.
to code, to do this coding that they're doing and need these larger companies and so forth. So boy, I love the fact of what these things are doing to fund schools and education. And then when they start putting that into additional education, so their payment to these students, so to speak, is in credit hours, it's just huge and so creative.
If there's anything you can send me on that program, I'd be very interested.
Well, if you feel free, and if I have your contact information or John could hook you up, I'd love to keep you up to speed on it and on both of it. But you can contact me. I can either give you my cell phone number, my contact information, or I can get yours and we can exchange that. Maybe John or Carrie could help do that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, we can do that.
Super.
Very good. I know that Tom said you have to leave
Yeah, unfortunately.
because I think we could be asking questions for the next 3 hours and still have.
Well, I'm happy to do this kind of thing anytime.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think we're extremely fortunate to be able to work with you and your group. And I know that you're focusing on our region of the state, and I understand. I know I've been to every one of Ohio's 88 counties, and unless you've been to Northwestern Ohio, I mean, you just don't realize it's night and day between here and there.
Oh, sure is.
It's just absolutely amazing. So we thank you very much. We look
Thank you
forward
for your
to hearing
time.
from you in the future, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks very much. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.